I was taught in Bible college and as a young guy, that what made God is just, which meant he must punish sinners for their sin. Right? He can't look the other way. He must punish us for our sin. Right? That's what makes God righteous. He's so holy, meaning he does everything right, that in the day he finds another people that haven't done everything right, he's got to punish those people. And that's how we define God as righteous or God is just. Right?
Yes.
And what I learned was that's what the fallen mind would think about righteous. That's what a mind stained with sin would think about it. That's not how God would think about it. So then I started thinking, well, how would God think about this? And then I think I said this in the message, but you have to first define what it is God thought was right in order to define what it means that he's righteous. Right? What did God first think is right? What he first thought was right was that these people, that they would live eternally and not die. And that they would experience my life eternally and not die. That they would know what it's like for me to serve them with my love and my life all the days of their life, and that they could live and not die. That's what he first thought is right. So when God would think of what is right and what is not right, he wouldn't be thinking of punishing people or not punishing people. He'd be thinking of what he dreamt, his picture, right? And anything that got crooked from his picture is what he would think isn't right.
Yes.
And so then, when he thought of what isn't right and how he would bring rightness to it, it would be by making the picture like he first saw it.
Yeah.
Right? So what would be unjust in God's eyes is for man to be dying. It would be unjust in God's eyes for our hearts to be filled with fear, shame, guilt. It would be unjust in God's mind for us to be laboring and toiling, trying to make a body for ourselves that can't die. If he sees that, he thinks, that's not right. It's not right because it doesn't fit with his original intent. And so when he thinks of bringing justice, or when he thinks of, or God being just, or God being righteous would manifest, it's from the perspective of making straight what had gotten crooked.
Yes.
So he created us to be able to stand in his presence and feel blameless and holy. So, God is righteous, meaning he would come and do something to where we could stand in his presence and feel holy and without blame. Right? That's what he would want to do. God is righteous would mean he comes to remove the fear out of our heart and replace it with his love. Right? That's what God is righteous would mean. Right? That's what it would mean for God to be just. What was crooked is that there wasn't a human seated in the Godhead. That was what was crooked. And so when God thought of making things straight, he didn't think of, I need to spank them and give them a punishment and then it can be straight. He thought of, how are we going to get humans who were dying in the earth to be seated at my right hand, never dying again? How are we going to sort that out? That's what he would be thinking. Right? And so it wasn't a figment of his imagination that we're dying.
No.
So we're really dying. So the first thing he's got to say is, how am I going to separate them from this death that they've now been joined to? Right? And so then he starts thinking, well, I'm going to become a human, and I'm going to take their death into myself. And then I'm going to take their death into the grave. And then I'm going to be resurrected free from their death. And that's going to be the platform from where I recreate the human race. And now all humans will be divorced from death. And now I can come again and promise them eternal life free from their works.
Yes.
That all those who believe can find eternal life dwelling in them, and that they can live eternally and not die. Meaning all those who want to live eternally and not die. Right?
Yeah.
That's basically what it means. If you don't want to live eternally and not die, God will bow his head to you as a co-equal and allow you to have what you want. Right? Depending on how you want to believe, just to use Bible language, he'll allow you to return to the dust of the ground. Right?
Yep.
And so that's what God thinks about. It's not right that there isn't a human seated at my right hand, because that's why I made them. Then he sees what's keeping us from there. Then he sets about to rectify that. Right?
Yes.
Does that make sense? And that's the foundation for everything he did. he felt in his heart, it isn't right that they're dying. And the motivation for what he did is that he was grieved. You want to know what God felt about our sin? You really want to know what God felt about us when he saw us in our sin? What do you see Jesus do when he finds Lazarus dead?
Cries.
Mm-hmm.
And just go read what it says. And if you want a really good description of what Jesus felt, is it Brennan Manning? Yeah. Brennan Manning does like a 5-minute clip where he talks about what Jesus felt. You can Google it. And he really gets into it. But Jesus didn't just cry. It says he was rent in the deepest part of his being. You ever felt that thing in the back of your throat when something horrible happens that you just like, you feel overwhelmed by, almost like your breath has been knocked out of you? Mm-hmm. That's what God thought. That's what God felt when he saw us in our sin. He wasn't busy being like angry, like I need to punish them. Like my dad had a lump in the back of his throat when he saw me laying there in the hospital bed. He wasn't thinking I needed to be punished. I mean, I was experiencing the greatest punishment there could be. I was dead. There's no more greater punishment than to be dead. And my father had a lump in the back of his throat, and all I could think of is, how can we keep this kid alive long enough to where he'll come out of this? How can we get him out of the hospital room and keep him alive long enough to where he stops doing these drugs? That's what he was thinking. And so God's the same way. He's got this lump in the back of his throat, and he sees us dying. And that's the problem he has with our sin, is that we're dying. And so he thinks it's not right that they're dying. I feel in my heart that when I see these people, my kids, and I see them dying, I don't care what they've done.
Right.
It's not right that they're dying. And that's the problem he's going to have. And when I say he doesn't care what we've done, please understand what I'm saying. Right? It's not that he says, it doesn't matter. It's that he would think of it in the sense of that he doesn't want us to die.
Right.
Yeah.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
And so God looked on our sin in that way. Right. It rent him in the deepest part of his being, and he felt something inside himself that said it isn't right. Right? Because God never looked at what we deserve based on our works. Right. That's where people get it confused. Because we trusted in our works, that wisdom dwelled in the earth, we began defining everything from works. Well, God never defined things from there. So when God thought of what we deserved, his first thought of what we deserved came before Adam could ever do anything.
Right.
He judged what man deserved before we could even decide. He never changed that thought.
Yeah.
So when he saw us dying, he acknowledged that the wages of our sin is death. But when he thought of what we deserve, he didn't think of what we had done right or wrong. No. He thought of what he dreamt for us from the beginning. Do you see?
Yep.
And so then from that foundation, he's rent in the deepest part of his being, thinking it's not right. And then from there, the Father, Son, and Spirit would come together and say, let us.
Yeah.
Right? Let us make straight what has gotten crooked.
Yes.
Our man has eaten from the tree and is dying. And when I say man, that means man and woman.
Right.
Okay? They've eaten from the tree, they're dying. Right? Let us redeem them from this death. And let us bring about glory and immortality in their bodies so they can live and never die, and we can serve them with our life and our love for all eternity. Right?
Yeah.
And then he set about to do that.
Right.
That's the heart of God.
Right.
Now, if you come in and replace that, you see what I just described? All of you that got kids, you know what I'm saying is true.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Now, it's a big deal what you believe about was in God's heart when he did what he did. If you replace what I just described with God must punish, that changes the whole thing. You no longer really see God as Abba. You see God as taskmaster.
Yes.
In fact, you're looking at God as Pharaoh now. And you're trying to have a relationship with Pharaoh.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
And now you acting as if it's the gospel of Pharaoh.
Right.
All your thoughts about God are more consistent with Pharaoh than they are with what Jesus revealed. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Because Jesus is the Word made flesh about what it means that God is righteous.
Yeah.
He's the Word made flesh about the righteousness of God. And so that's why I made a point to go into the Sermon on the Mount. Because what Jesus is God, what do you see Jesus do to the sinners leading up to the cross? What do you see him doing there? You see him punishing them?
No.
Can you find any example of Jesus punishing the sinners?
Nope.
Why not?
Sometimes.
That's not the problem.
Because that's not what makes God just or righteous.
Right.
Right?
Right.
And so now when you think of what is it that makes God righteous, you look to the face of Jesus. And you see what makes God righteous is that He's the friend of sinners. He's good to sinners. He prays for sinners. He lays His life down for the life of sinners. It takes a righteous person to lay down their life for a sinner. I mean, what does Paul go on and say? He says that, well, maybe for a righteous person that someone can lay down their life. Maybe for somebody who's done the right thing. But God has demonstrated His love in that He laid down His life for the ungodly. And so when we think of what makes God righteous, we ought not be able to find that anywhere else in the world or the earth. It ought not be a simple thing to just mimic.
Right.
Right?
Right.
Well, how easy is it to find somebody punishing a sinner in the world?
Piece of cake.
It's everywhere, isn't it?
Sure.
Okay. Well, how many God is there? How many like God is there? One? Maurice just said, there's only one who's righteous. Everyone's going out of the way except for God. And so we need to have a metanoia, or a change of mind about how we think of righteous. It takes a righteous guy to lay down his life for a sinner. It takes like an otherworldly kind of thought for us, right? When you encounter the righteousness of God, it ought to make you question every thought you ever had about what would make someone righteous. Do you see what I'm saying? And I think the world would think it's the righteous thing to punish a sinner.
Sure.
We all think of they getting what they deserve.
Right.
They deserve this or that.
Retribution. Yeah.
Right, retribution. That's a common thought in the world.
Absolutely.
Well, then when we think about God, it ought to be the opposite. Do you see what I'm saying? I mean, I said this in the message, I think. Even the devil can punish sinners. And that's how we're going to define the righteousness of God? So even the devil can punish sinners. The world punishes sinners as people being punished today. We put people on death row all the time. The world punishes sinners. Even the devil can punish sinners. And now we're going to say what makes God righteous is that He punishes sinners? We don't need a God to punish sinners.
Nope.
We need a God to lay down His life for sinners. Because that's the kind of thing that human beings, apart from the Spirit of God, can't even fathom or think of. Right? It takes a revelation of the love of God to even fathom that kind of a thought.
And listen, what you believe